Okay, so let's get started with our first lecture of the Introduction to GIS Systems, or the GIS definition. As we are online, I'm obviously not going to go over the course introduction. I expect that if you had any questions, you probably saw it in the syllabus. So to get into this, we're going to talk about what a GIS is today. Most people, when they hear GIS, even if they have no understanding of what the actual term means, they usually think of a single program that is created by Esri in Redlands, California, which is ArcMap, which is the program we'll be using for this course, or ArcPro, or maybe a couple of others. But in reality, GIS is a much more encompassing term, and it includes both the discipline as well as the program in which we're going to really talk about. I won't get into the history here. I'll probably get into it a little bit later, but in reality, GIS was a kind of a term that was invented in the 1960s, and then it blossomed out in the 70s and 80s, and then shrunk down into a select group of programs that had a core fundamental group around them to encourage users to continually using these programs. So GIS is important, right? Flat out. I mean, you wouldn't be here if you didn't think that it had some sort of important factor in your life. And the reality is that it has, it's important because most information in this world has a spatial component. If we go back to the 2016 election, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, they wanted to know where these individuals were because there was a spatial component that they could use to essentially sway an election. If they knew what to say to a specific individual in a specific location, they could sway an election. And a lot of that had to do with spatial data. To give a basic example of this, you're not going to say the same thing to a person in northern New Hampshire that you would in southern California. While they live in the same country, their views are going to be very different. So if you want to sway an election, you need to word or choose your examples very carefully of how you want to sway these individuals towards going to a specific side. GIS, it consists of several things. So essentially, it consists of locations, right? So we take locations of areas, and within those locations, we understand the networks of those locations. So how does point A relate to point B? And then within those networks, we look at the areas. So how do these specific networks interact within an area? How many students are within Buffalo, and how does this network of individuals relate to people that go to one campus versus another campus? And then that continuously grows out as we get further out and out until we are finally examining the entire world, or in some cases, other worlds. I sat in a class this semester in which a student used a GIS to look at essentially hill formations on Mars. I won't get into any more than that, but I mean, we can use this type of program to measure anything in the universe. It also has some sort of temporal purpose, albeit it's not good. To give the example from this graph here, you can basically see that you can measure a piece of data or several pieces of data according to time. It's not very effective. The reason for this is that when you're measuring space, the measurements you have for space are very different than what you have for time. They're essentially going in opposite directions, and because of that, the computer program that is essentially set up to measure space doesn't really function well when you're trying to measure time, and it makes it very hard to work within each other at the same time. We've gotten better in terms of a field to measuring these. It's still not great. So if you want to measure temporal reasoning, you may end up having a much more clunky time than you would be for spatial. It's useful. I mean, GIS is unbelievably useful. I'm the first one to tell you that. I mean, although I'm the one here telling you about it, so obviously I think it's a little useful, but it helps to answer the W questions. So where, what, when, why, how, who, what if. And it really does, what it does is it shows the what and where. Where is X and what is X? And it really allows us to help construct questions and meaning to these other ideas. And it helps to generate hypotheses. So from my own work, I believe a tomb is visible from an entire landscape. I can't measure that on my own without the help of the computer. So I use a GIS to generate and test this hypothesis. Once this hypothesis is proven to be factual, I can then add my own spin on the proof to essentially pull more meaning outside of this hypothesis. So, being a little tricky here, I guess. I didn't think that was going to work that way. Oh, well. So what a GIS does is it incorporates different types of information. In many ways, it incorporates a bunch of different ideas that allow us to layer them on top of each other in order to see how they operate. So we can take social factors. So is there an increased rise of diabetes in a specific area? If so, what's the biodiversity? So are there different plants? Are there different individuals? What is going on here? How does this change, right? So, and then we can then layer that on top of it and look at, engineering aspects. Are there streetlights? Are there roads? What type of waste management does it have? All these different ideas. And then we can layer land use on top of that, or underneath that, I should say, in which we're essentially classifying large swaths of land according to how we use them or how we don't use them. And there's an entire classification that allows us to outline what these are and how these different patches of land are used and how they can then relate to the larger equation that is being measured within a GIS. And then on top of that, there's other environmental considerations such as soils data or elevation or slope or types of water, or you can pretty much construct any sort of environmental aspect, and there is likely some sort of data set or derived piece of data that you can gain in order to measure this sort of environmental purpose. So it's used by a wide range of disciplines. I would say I would challenge anybody to really find an area in which GIS can't be used. I think if you can't think of a way for GIS to be used, you just haven't thought long enough. Although maybe philosophy would be a little bit difficult to find a perfect idea for it, but I would argue that in reality, it's not so much how philosophy uses GIS as much as GIS can help or it can use philosophy. And it really has changed how we operate, both as a larger academic culture, I guess, or archaeologists ourselves. Prior to archaeologists having access to GIS, which was, I believe, the first example of GIS is really in the 1970s. Zubro and Harbrough wrote in an Ian Hodder edited volume discussing the purpose of GIS, but it wasn't until the 1980s that archaeologists got a hold of a personal computer in which a GIS was able to be implemented and really focused on in the field rather than being housed within an academic area. But I won't bother you with all of that. That's a pretty long and convoluted story. But it's opened a number of opportunities. Really, there's a whole side of archaeology and of many other fields in which spatial technology has really just opened all these other doors, and in many ways, it's actually created its own field. While we use so many ideas and so many constructions from different academic fields, such as sociology or geology or geography, GIS itself has become its own discipline in which people are actually examining both what GIS does, how we think about a GIS, or how we can push this notion of GIS forward. So just a few facts. It's pretty straightforward. There are NSF grants just for GIS alone. I actually work with an individual in my own department who's got a multi-million dollar GIS grant to essentially pull all these different schools together and all these different aspects of the environment around the Great Lakes to look at how climate change is affecting the Great Lakes. And it's through the use of GIS. There are a number of GIS programs that are within government agencies. The GIS known as GRASS, GRASS, was actually developed by the U.S. military and was later released to the general public. There are a number of consulting firms and contracts that are out to bid. Technically, if you so wanted to, you could bid on a contract that is put out by a construction company or any number of different groups to essentially do GIS freelance work for a company as a contracted employee. But there are also consulting firms, and they are everywhere. If you put in a GIS analyst job online into a job website like Indeed, you will pretty much be guaranteed to get several job notifications a day. And you don't need to scan the entire country or the entire world. Usually there is one job within my area of Western New York a day. And I guarantee that there are more in more densely populated areas. And like any academic discipline, there are conferences that are designated just for the use of GIS. There are journals and professional societies that are completely related to the purpose and creation of GIS. So it's a big deal. I think I've kind of beat that in enough now, but just to make sure that I've incorporated this, I stole a couple of links from my mentor here. It's in the journal Nature. This first link is a little tidbit within the journal that is it's essentially a feature of an individual. It's on Jack Dangermond and the creation of GIS and really what Esri does in Redlands. Jack Dangermond is the owner and founder of Esri, which is a private company. It's never gone public, and he's a very, very wealthy man, but also a very humble and very nice man, actually. I've met him several times now. And he is essentially responsible for the future and current state of the field. Esri is by far and away the largest GIS firm, I guess is one way to put it, in the world. Disney is a client, NASA is a client, the U.S. government is a client. I mean, the U.S. government created, like I said earlier, the U.S. government created their own GIS and then bought the proprietary software from Esri because Esri's was so much better. The second link is also just a kind of a blurb about how it's a growing discipline and how there are always jobs. And the reason for this is essentially that while many academic disciplines have realized the beauty of having spatial data, the private sector is just now coming into its own, maybe over the last 10 years, in which they've realized just how important this spatial data can be. And you'll see that there are a number of businesses, banks, archaeology firms, obviously, oil companies. I mean, you name it. I really can't think of any townships, state governments. I mean, really everywhere that they are now seeing the beauty of having a spatial analyst that works for them full time. Even if you aren't always working on a major project or creating your own, there are little tidbits that you can do to help enhance the beauty of whatever is going on within that company. So let's briefly move into the history here. I believe I'm going to touch on it later within the course, but I'll really want to hit this now. But the earliest idea of a GIS is actually Ian McHarg, I believe is how you'd say his name, in 1969 at the University of Pennsylvania with his book Design in Nature. He's actually a landscape architect, or was rather, in which he basically realized that if he took printouts from a computer of maps that were the same size and were all showing different pieces of data, but were all color coordinated to match in a certain way, if you pressed down on these layers, you were able to really highlight what the highest or lowest values of all of these data combined would be, which is essentially the earliest form of layering within a GIS, which is still in many ways what we do, just in a much more high-tech way. So if there's anything that you can take away from this first lecture, it's these two definitions. And I'm going to read them because these are really key to everything we do. And that the more and more you think about these definitions as you advance through your career and into your experimentation with GIS, you realize just how important these definitions are. So in terms of a process-oriented definition, A GIS is a computer-based system that provides for the collection, storage, analysis, and display of georeference data. Essentially the same thing that Ian McHarg was doing, just in a nice, futuristic, computer-savvy way. The problem-solving oriented definition is a little different. It's a decision support system involving the integration of spatially referenced data in a problem-solving environment. Saying almost the same thing, but in a little different way, in which it's focused more on the idea that we can solve problems by feeding data into an area and help us make decisions instead of just a storage base. To make it a little bit easier, for a little bit of a study idea, the idea of Dickey, I guess is really how you would say it, is how I was instructed to think about what we do with a GIS. So at its base core, we feed data into a machine. That machine helps us gather information from the data. Data itself is not information. It is just what we give to a visualization software or to a problem solving software in which we ourselves are able to interpret information. From that interpretation, we gain knowledge. And through that knowledge, we are able to increase our intelligence. So when we're thinking about the duality of definitions here for a GIS, there are also two ideas of what GIS means, and that's GIS systems and GIS science. For the purpose of this course, we are going to be more focused on GIS systems, right? It's the introduction to GIS, so we're thinking about the system rather than the inclusion of or the expansion of the science. So GIS system is really the software, the hardware, and is used as a tool to support a project, right? So we think about how ArcMap can help us solve whatever problem we're working on with data that we feed into it. The GIS science is the reference to the specific field of scientific study that is specifically focused on GIS. And this is what I mentioned before, in which there really has been an opening of this whole new discipline in which there's an incorporation of a number of different fields. These fields could be things like manual cartography. You can draw a map in GIS. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? And the same principles that you would do to normally draw a map on pen and paper can really be transferred straightforward into a GIS system. Another really key one that I will consistently hammer down on is database management systems. GIS is very much a database management system. It's really just a high-powered and well-covered database. Databases they sound really cool and really complex, but in reality, they're just an Excel spreadsheet that has a user interface. And when you think about your ArcMap, while it's really easy to look at all the different layers and all the different functions that you can click and press, you have to remember at its very core, it's still just a spreadsheet. It's just a spreadsheet that's been covered up to make it easier or make more functions more accessible. Another field here is obviously CAD. It's the same as manual cartography, but at a much smaller scale in most cases, in which you have a curiosity about a smaller area or the functions that you would do to go about drawing or how we would be able to implement CAD drawings into a GIS are still very important. Computer mapping is also part of this. Automated and facility mapping, this is essentially the difference between letting machine draw a map or create a map for us through different data pieces or having us draw a map. So if I so happen to wanted to draw an archaeological site, I have two ways of doing that. I could take points of artifact distribution and have a pretty good understanding of the outlines of a site, or I could let someone, haphazardly draw something in a CAD, and then I could implement it into a GIS to make it something usable. Another part of that is land information systems. So that and remote sensing in a lot of ways is essentially remote sensing or satellite imagery or field walking or things of ways of understanding, how we use and how we understand our environment. which all kind of incorporate this whole GIS system. So if I can incorporate another idea, it's not just mapping. It does spatial operations. And really that's the key here for archaeologists, as you've probably realized already. While I have tried to make this course more focused, and I will continue to try and keep this open towards all disciplines, there's going to be a specific slant towards archaeology, as I myself am an archaeologist. And this is something that archaeologists really don't quite understand. And it may be simple for some of you, for others, this might not be as clear. GIS, one of the functions of a GIS is to create a map, but that does not mean you do GIS. If you create a map, you make a map. Good job. But you're not doing GIS. To do GIS or to use a GIS, you need to do spatial operations. That means incorporating multiple pieces of data and doing some sort of mathematical formula or function with those data to understand how the output works, right? And this is where the idea for archaeologists from geographers or GIS scientists come from. Archaeologists make great maps. They do. We make fantastic maps, and I'll be the first to say that. But more often than not, we don't know how to use a GIS. And that's because in our mind, GIS data or GIS as a computer program isn't well suited to the archaeological data. And in many ways, that's just not true. It's just a cop-out from our own field in which we actually just want to say, oh, we can only use it so much because our data is biased or whatnot. And it saves us from having to do a function or create our own functions when we can just steal it from somebody else, because like many, we are just thieves of technology. But these spatial operations, I'm off my soapbox on why archaeologists are horrible GIS analysts, but these spatial operations can be things like, where is object A? So where is the University at Buffalo? Where is A in relation to B? Where is the University at Buffalo's North Campus in relation to its South Campus? Where are they in relation to each other? And how many occurrences of type A are there within distance D of B? How many vineyards are within 15 kilometers around Orvieto, Italy? Another great idea in terms of, the situation that we currently find ourselves in, GIS can be used to evaluate disease. Currently, if you go on to Esri's website, you will see a map that highlights coronavirus numbers, I believe by the hour. It may be by the day now, but it was for a while in March by the hour. And this is really, you can essentially map populations at risk or potential areas of disease. The example here that you see is actually from Zika, but it's been used for everything. I think as early as December 2019, I received messages and emails from multiple sources within my department and from the government to look at coronavirus numbers and see if there could be geospatial analysis done with these GIS numbers. Another medical example of this is also, how many cardiovascular patients have a cardiologist within 5 miles. This example is taken from one of my classmates, in which they basically used a very simple analysis to plot where the cardiovascular patients were in Buffalo and how many were within a 5-mile area from an actual working cardiology office. So, if they had a problem, could they get there in time? And these green show light, yes, you can get there, but red, in fact, shows that, you can't. Another great one is, identification or awareness of hazardous sites. This is a much older example, but, are there toxic waste dumps near your high school? I mean, if I were a parent, that might be something I want to be aware of. Or, as a town analyst, that might be something to consider when building a new high school. If there's a toxic dump, I don't want to have the children of the town or of the city going near it. Another example from this could be UPS or FedEx or Amazon using GIS to essentially deliver vehicles. And you can measure the least distance, the least cost, or total wear and tear it takes on your vehicle, or gas mileage, or the fastest route. And all of this can be rather simply calculated within a GIS, but it doesn't always mean that it's the same value. So to give an idea here, if I want to go up and over a mountain, that may be the least distance or the shortest distance, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the least costly. It's going to increase the amount of damage or cost into my vehicle. It's probably going to take more gasoline than going around on the highway. So, to consider these spatial operations, you're essentially, what is the value of function z at position x? What is the value of the radiation exposure of the dump at the new school position? Or how large is B? How large is the campus of the University of Florida? Or what is the result of intersecting various spatial data? And at first this sounds kind of convoluted, but really what it means is that, what is the intersection of mirrors and tombs? What kind of mirrors are found in what type of Etruscan tombs, and how do they relate? You can actually visualize this information with the proper functions within a GIS. Other examples include, what is the path of least cost resistance or distance along the ground from X to Y? How can FedEx figure out how to deliver a package to my building? Or what is point X1 or X2? Personally, in my own work, I have over 4,000 archaeological sites within Western New York. If looking at a map of all of these archaeological sites, I can't tell you the exact location of each of these. I need a database management system within my GIS that holds all of the information I need to understand what these sites are, so that I can visualize what they are and understand what they are from clicking on a specific point. Or, again, what objects are next to objects that having certain combinations of attributes, right? So what type of people or what type of social factors are related to an increased value of coronavirus? So this will be the end of the total presentation. I will try to keep this under 30 minutes per class. I don't really believe in really going further, as for much of us in this class, it's going to be their first time really getting into GIS, and some of these classes will be really, really complex and others won't be as bad. So we're kind of going to ease into this slowly and really try to stick around the 30-minute marker per lecture, as it will be really like the most information you can hold, and it kind of fits quite well into the total number of classes we have for this course. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and you will be receiving your next lecture in a couple of days. Thanks.